The man slept on the beach for 3 days and 3 nights. But when he woke up and looked around, he was shocked to find his crew lying on the beach asleep. Then he walked over to the crew until he saw their white faces and realized that they had been dead for a long time. He didn't have time to be sad, so he took off the crewman's shoes and put them on his feet. He tried on the heels and found that they felt pretty good. The man then searched the beach, hoping to find the rest of the crew alive. Along the way, he found another dead crew member in addition to his own shipwrecked boat, so he dragged him ashore and buried him on a cross on the beach, adding a shirt to his own back. Then he packed his backpack and climbed to the top of the mountain to see if he could find his way home. After 2 hours of hiking, Edison finally reached the top of the mountain and the view was beautiful. But the bad news was that not a single fishing boat passed by and there was no land as far as the eye could see. He threw away his backpack in anger. Desperate, Edison vented his feelings and then had to face the reality that he was going to survive on the deserted island and then try to find a way to get help. At this point, he was thirsty and hungry and wanted to find something to eat. On the way he found some coconuts with a stone to knock down some of the stone and then hard to hit the stone. In his persistent efforts, the coconut finally cracked open. He quickly put in his mouth to enjoy this hard-earned sweet water. After drinking his fill, he was ready to find a suitable place to rest. But then he heard a fierce screams. Edison followed the sound and found his dog Sabin trapped in a cave. He was delighted at this discovery, and without a moment's hesitation, Edison jumped down the rock. He scolded the dog for being so stupid and the dog immediately fell to the ground and apologized to his master. With company, Edison felt less lonely, and then he started a fire with a flint. He hadn't eaten for 3 days and nights, so he rubbed his hands together and fought off his hunger. Nevertheless, he slept with his dog until dawn, when he woke up ready to go back to the ship to collect useful supplies. Although the wind and waves were very strong, but he still decided to jump into the sea. Dog Sebastian was very worried about his safety. Constantly howling, Edison quickly signaled that the problem is not serious. After a great deal of effort, he finally arrived at the ship and the only survivors on the deck were a few rats. Then he went to the cabin and smashed the locks on the cabinets and opened the doors and found a lot of muskets, and then he found a lot of useless gold coins in the boxes. Then he found a lot of red wine. This discovery made Edison very excited. He was going to have a drink first, but just then the ship suddenly creaked and was about to sink. He didn't dare to delay and hurriedly carried all the useful supplies to the decks. Then he used a rope to tie all the supplies together to make a working raft and then successfully transported them to the shore through the waves. With this, 1 man and 1 dog had a shelter. But at night, while eating bread, they heard the sound of a wild boar, and 1 man and 1 dog were so frightened that they stared in disbelief. But they didn't dare to take any action. After all, wild boars are very aggressive. When Edison woke up the next morning, he realized that half of the supplies had been damaged by the boar, so he decided to go to the woods with his shotgun to kill the boar. But that's when he made an even more horrifying discovery. In order to get off the island, the man made a boat and chose some strong trees and cut them down with an axe, then sawed the wood into thin planks. For the rest of the day, Edison worked all night long, even when his hands were bloodied. But after days of labor, he lost the protein his body needed, so he caught wild ducks from the sea and raised them in a pen. And before long he was eating delicious charcoal roasted duck. Then a burst of smell came to his nose. Edison tore off a piece of meat into his mouth. Is really delicious. As time went by, Edison's boat took shape. In order to launch the boat, he laid logs underneath it. Then he boiled a pot of resin glue and applied it to the seams so that the planks could be glued together. Before long, the boat was finally finished and Edison couldn't hide his good mood when he was about to leave the deserted island. He took his old coat out of his suitcase, took a mirror and organized his appearance and dressed up carefully. Before he set sail, he lit a firecracker to celebrate his departure from the island, and his dog was very happy. Then he pushed the dagger into the sandbag. As the sand became less and less, the lever began to work and the boat began to move uncontrollably towards the sea under the inertia of the logs. But Edison, who was so full of anticipation, never expected that the boat would hit the hard rock and in a flash the boat would be torn apart. Edison could not believe what was happening in front of his eyes. Almost half a year's hard work has come to naught. He was desperate. Time flies like an arrow and the years passed quickly. A year passed, and this year Edison also thought of using other ways to escape from the island, but the huge waves made him give up this idea again. So he settled down on the island and sowed the seeds he had collected from the ship into the soil and watered them diligently every day. And in his spare time, he even surrounded the pepper seedlings with shells. But day after day was always boring. Luckily he had his dog to keep him company and keep him from going crazy. But even these days were few and far between. One day, while Edison was feeding the dog, he suddenly realized that Sabin had lost his appetite. At first, Edison thought the dog thought he was a bad cook, so he threw Sabin's favorite bone into the bowl. But the dog still had no appetite. It wasn't until Edison felt the dog's dry nose that he realized he was sick. In a few moments, Sebastian collapsed on the floor, dying. Edison was heartbroken. He took the dog to his bed and poured a spoonful of red wine and fed it to the dog in the hope that the dog would get well soon. But Edison was still very worried, shed tears and stayed up all night. He did not dare to imagine how he could live on the island without his beloved dog. He could only pray that God would bless the dog. However, 2 days passed. but Saipan did not survive and left his owner forever. Edison carried the dead dog to the beach and buried him there. Saddened, Edison could only beat the waves to vent his emotions. Without his companion, Edison's life was like years. He felt that the island was a prison where he was confined. Until one day, he suddenly noticed a few rafts coming towards the island not far offshore. Alert! He grabbed his shotgun and went to see what was going on. There were several rafts on the water, heading for the island, and Edison, alert with his shotgun, was ready to go and see what was going on. What he didn't expect was a wave of Indians who had come to perform a sacrifice for their dead chief. But the sacrifice was to be made with the lives of 3 of their own people, and it was bloody and brutal. Edison, horrified that he might one day be sacrificed, pulled the trigger to scare the savages away. The Indians were stunned when they heard the shot, and one of the sacrificed men took advantage of the situation to escape. But Edison soon ran into the fleeing Indian, and by pointing his gun at his head and signaling him to keep quiet, he was able to escape the pursuing enemy. Seeing the rest of the people in the boat to leave the island, Edison, hanging heart, finally relaxed. He untied the rope in the hands of the Indian, let the Indian call him master. But he could not understand his language. But at least he had company and was no longer alone. Edison was so excited that he took the Indian home and showed him how to wipe his face, and the Indian followed suit. And then he taught the Indian how to speak at the table and in his own language. Late at night, Edison, fearing that the Indian might escape, locked him up with a hinge. But when Edison awoke the next day, he found the Indian gone. He dipped his hand in the blood and found it still warm. Sensing something was wrong, he took his shotgun and went in search of the Indian. Sure enough, white smoke rose from the woods of the island, and then Edison cautiously made his way into the woods and found a dying fire with a handful of bones in it, which he judged to be the work of the horrible Indian. Then he followed the trail of blood and saw the Indian's head. Edison was so frightened that he backed away. Suddenly, a figure shifted and Edison stepped forward with his shotgun, not realizing that he was about to be caught in a trap. He was hung from the tree, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get free. Eventually Edison was tied to the tree, but he wondered where the Indian had gotten his duck. The next morning Edison awoke to find the ropes untied and wondered why the Indian hadn't hurt him. When he got home, Edison realized that 3 of his ducks were missing, and he knew it was the Indians who had done it. So he took his shotgun and decided to settle the score. As the 2 men fought, they hit the swamp, and when they realized they were only half alive. But the Indian was used to this kind of situation, and he leaned back as far as he could to increase the area of force and then climbed to the shore in a few strokes through the weeds. Edison was left in the swamp in despair. He tried to struggle, but the swamp soon reached his head and he could only look at the other man with helpless eyes, hoping that the Indian would save him. Fortunately, the Indian was kind enough to understand him instantly, and he came to the tree and pressed the branch down with his weight. And then Edison grabbed hold of the branch and was saved. Edison was thrilled to be reborn, and as he was cleaning himself from the mud in the sea, he saw the Indian stealing his ducks again. This time Edison wasn't angry. After all, he had just saved his life. A few days later, Edison came to the woods and found the Indians making a raft over a charcoal fire. So he struck up a conversation and learned his name was Andrew. Although he didn't speak the language, the Indians were kind enough to hand him food, and I have to say, it tasted pretty good. But when Edison found out that the food was bat meat, he was not so sure. When Edison saw that Andrew was still using a stone axe to cut wood, he deliberately used his own axe to cut the branches of the tree a few times in order to annoy the other party. This really made Andrew to get depressed. As time passed, the 2 became friends and they were able to communicate with each other. And Edison's hunting skills improved so much that he could easily hunt a wild boar, and he would share the food with Andrew. But Andrew was still not accustomed to the eating habits of modern civilization. He just grabbed the food and drank the blood. Edison understood that even though their habits were different, he still chose to respect them. He would help Andrew to make a raft so that he could go back to his tribe. And as he watched him go away, Edison was filled with sadness. In the following days he lived alone on the desert island, although life was extremely boring, but Andrew would occasionally come to visit him on the island. Until one day Edison was writing in his diary when he suddenly heard a gunshot. He understood that this is the modern civilization have. He couldn't wait to get to the house, and sure enough, a large ship ran aground a short distance away. Edison was thrilled, running and waving for help, but when he got close enough to see it, he couldn't help himself. But as he got closer, he realized that the white men were chasing Andrews. As he watched his friend being taken, Edison had a vague feeling that something was wrong, for he knew that the rich often went to the tribes and took some of the natives back as slaves. So Edison swam out to the big boat, and the captain, seeing that he was a modern man and spoke English, invited him into his cabin. Edison told him about his experiences on the island over the past 5 years and gained the captain's trust. In the early hours of the morning, when the crew was asleep, Edison carefully went on deck and unlocked the cage in which Andrew was being held. After saying a brief goodbye to the other side, Andrew took the raft Edison had prepared for him and successfully returned to the tribe. In the end, Edison, who had been stranded on the desert island for 5 years, was able to return to modern civilization.